Recently, I realized that I only own one pair of pajamas, so I really needed to change that. As soon as this idea was in my head, I went onto a fabric website and found the perfect fabric for this project. Not only is it really soft and really stretchy with a really nice pattern on it, it was even more perfect because it was very low in price. Originally, it was listed for £18, but I got it for just £8 a meter. So obviously it just felt like all the stars were aligning and I had to get this fabric. When I sew, I usually focus on creating something that I can't buy in a shop, but for this I knew I had to be a little bit more practical because I need to be able to sleep in it. So I based my design off sportswear and created a short tight top and a matching pair of short tight shorts that are both embellished with straps. These straps will add on that can't be bought in a shop element that I really need to be motivated to finish a project. With the design all set, I moved straight on to pattern making. For the shorts, I did things a little differently to what I normally would, and I actually cut up a pair of underwear for it. Usually I would trace out all the pieces I would need, but I'd actually just thrown these underwear away, mainly because they have a giant hole in the crotch. So cutting them up was a good way of giving them purpose rather than just throwing them away. Also, with using this specific underwear as a pattern piece, I knew that they were a little bit tight on me when I actually did wear them. So that would mean I wouldn't have to pattern in those gaps down the side to add on the straps. With my pattern pieces created, I just traced out all the pieces that I would need. I chose to use underwear as a base because I didn't want to have any central seams on these shorts. I've had PJ shorts in my time that have a central seam and they just really hurt to wear, even if I consciously pull them down slightly. So it just made a lot more sense to create some shorts that were completely flat on both the front and the back and only met at a singular seam that went across the body and didn't cut through it. The great thing about making your own clothes is that you can take clothes that you like the idea of but don't like the fit of and improve them to be something that you actually really want to wear. Once I had all my pieces cut out, I then sewed together my front crotch piece. These pieces were slightly different from the rest because I double layered them. I did this for two reasons. Firstly, I don't like a completely flat crotch, so I wanted to add a bit of a curve to the front of the shorts, but to do this I needed to add a central seam, which like I just said really irritates me, so adding a secondary layer would completely flatten the seam and make it not an issue. And secondly, I wasn't planning to wear underwear with these shorts, and therefore they needed to have a gusset for all the reasons that you would normally need a gusset in underwear for. With that front panel completed, I then moved on to adding on the additional panels onto the front piece. This process was a lot harder than I expected it to be because I've never made this shape of clothing before, nor have I attempted French seams before, so it was a learning process through and through. The shapes I was sewing on made me feel very unconfident in my ability to finish this project because it didn't look right at all for a longer time than usual. Usually I just have two pieces that I sew together at the crotch and they would automatically look like a pair of shorts. But with this I added on those first two panel pieces either side of the crotch piece and it just looked odd. I don't know what it was in person because in the footage it honestly looks completely fine and correct, but when I first saw these central leg pieces sewn on, I just wanted to throw the whole project away and just make the top. This just goes to show that I really need to slow down sometimes and look at things from a different perspective, because if I had just gotten out a pair of underwear and looked at them, I would have seen that what I had sewn was definitely a part of this type of clothing, and just because I hadn't paid attention to it before didn't mean that I'm doing anything wrong. I really need to trust my ability to recreate clothing. Not only do I do it all the time, but with this particular one I know that I just traced out actual pattern pieces rather than making up a pattern myself, so it was definitely going to work and it wasn't going to go wrong. So it's just one of those projects that was definitely going to work and I don't know why I was so stressed about it. Once I'd gotten over the stress, I then sewed my front and back panels together at the crotch. When I was cutting out my pattern pieces, I had been adding seam allowance onto everything, but I hadn't done it evenly on the front and back, so the crotch piece that I had for the back was completely different size to the crotch piece on the front, but luckily it was actually the bigger piece that I needed and not the smaller piece, so it worked out completely fine in the end. I just needed to first cut away a little bit of the back piece before sewing it together. Once this part was done, I could move on to making those strap pieces. The side strap started out as a long strip of fabric that I sewed into a tube, flipped around and ironed flat. I didn't want to use singular layers of fabric for this because the fabric rolls incredibly easily, so it would just never lay flat while I wear the shorts. I also just think it makes them look a little bit more professional because when you buy higher quality, more expensive clothing, they tend to have multiple layers of fabric rather than just one thin layer of fabric. So I thought this would elevate the piece slightly and make it more into something that I'd really like to wear. Once I had that long strip, I cut it into equal length pieces and decided exactly where I wanted them to go. In my original design, I wanted them to be sewn in crosses, but I decided against this because I didn't want to have bulky layers of fabric digging into me while I tried to sleep. So instead I decided to lay them across in single lines. To attach them into place and hide the seams, I went in with the same method I had for the rest of the shorts, which was a French seam method. This basically means sewing everything together wrong sides together first. This results on the seam being on the good side of the project. and then sew along that seam again with the fabric good size together, which envelopes all the raw seams into a tube that can then be sewn flat. I probably didn't need to do this for all my seams. Because this fabric is very thin, it wouldn't have irritated me, but I decided I didn't want anything to not match, so I did it anyway. Technically with the straps, I think they are half French seamed and half rolled hems, because the gaps between the straps aren't an attachment point, they are just rolled in on themselves. But the straps themselves are definitely done with the French seam method, at least to my knowledge. I might be doing it slightly wrong. I am definitely not an expert when it comes to sewing of any sort. Honestly, the only thing I actually know about French seams is that in France they call them English seams. I wonder why that happened. That will probably be a really interesting thing to look up after I film this video. With all my details in place, I then went on to adding that bottom hem onto both edges of my shorts. To do this, I started out by making another long tube of fabric, but this time I removed the stitches after ironing it to have a strip of fabric with ironed in seam allowances that could be sewn down directly onto the front of my shorts and then folded over themselves to create a hem that enveloped the bottom hem and hid away all the raw edges. Ordinarily, I would have sewn it in first before ironing it, but this fabric is quite difficult to make behave, so this method was a lot easier and less time consuming. It may look like the more convoluted way of getting this done, but trust me, with this fabric it was the only way of doing it without me throwing it out the window. Finally, for the shorts, I added on an elastic for the waistband. Like with everything else, I sewed this piece wrong size together, but I didn't French seam it. Instead, I did this so I could flip the elastic up into place and automatically hide the fabric raw edges due to its habit of rolling. I got really lucky with how well this elastic matched the fabric. Obviously, it's not the exact same colour as any of the colours in the print, but I feel like it has the same intensity of colour, so it really blends in without standing out too much. When I first sewed on the waistband, I wasn't quite happy with the fit, so I knew I needed to shorten it slightly. And to do this, I rolled the hem under the seam created by adding on those straps and sewed it into place as if it was an additional strap at the top. This way I didn't have to add any really obvious side seams into this project, and I could also make everything match together. With that said, the shorts are now done and I'm going to move on to talking about the top. With the top, I didn't film anywhere near as much because a lot of it's really repetitive to what I just did. So I won't go into as much detail as I did for the short process, but I still want to discuss certain things about it. For this project, I only purchased 1 meter of fabric and I really hadn't thought about how I was placing things when I was cutting out my shorts. I didn't have a lot of fabric left for the top. The front of the top was absolutely fine. I just traced around the only PJ top I own and called it a day. But for the back, I had to do some piecing things together. Ideally, the back would just be one single panel, but I ended up with 4 panels in the end. 2 for the back itself and then 2 for the shoulder straps. But once they were sewn together, I don't think it looks too bad, and I'm at least glad that both sides were symmetrical and I didn't have loads of seams all over the place that weren't on the other side. Once I actually had my front and back panels, I then sewed them together just using a regular seam, and then went on to adding those strap details down the center. Unlike with the shorts, I knew the seams on the top wouldn't bother me at all, so I didn't bother French seaming them. I also didn't do this because I didn't have a lot of fabric and I didn't want to make things overly tight. With the base top completed, I then added the elastic onto the bottom of it. I originally wasn't going to do this, but I just thought it looked better with the shorts. At this point, I was really running low on fabric, but I still needed to bind the edges of the armholes and the neck hole, so I decided that I needed to sacrifice the width of the fabric in order to cover all these areas. Ideally, these hems would be the same width that I use for my straps and the hem on the bottom of my shorts, but it just wasn't going to happen, and it is a little annoying and disappointing, but realistically, I'd rather have a finished piece with narrow hems than a piece with raw edges that I can't finish. Next time I do this sort of thing, I'm just gonna have to remember to buy more fabric. I thought it'd be absolutely fine because it's very stretchy and I was only making small amounts of clothing, but I always forget to take into account that a lot of the fabric is kind of unusable in the end. You end up with like little tiny awkward pieces that can't be made into anything else. So in the future, I will just buy a little tiny bit more fabric. Even if I just bought another half a meter, this project would have been so much easier to do. With that said, this project is now done and I can show you the final result. I am so happy with how these shorts in particular came out. I just don't have anything in my wardrobe that looks like this. I don't think they really look like pajama trousers. I think they look like sports trousers, but that's absolutely fine because I can definitely wear these to do my yoga. Obviously the print is very nightwear. It's got little moons and stars on it, which is exactly why I wanted to use it for this project. But I don't think anyone's really going to notice that because if I ever wear this to a gym, I've got massive holes in the side of it. So I think people are going to be more focusing on that. Not that I go to the gym, I work out in my house. I think if I was in a gym, I would feel rather uncomfortable with this amount of skin on show. But maybe I could wear these to a pride event and they'd be absolutely fine and they wouldn't even stand out at all. Obviously, I'm not a stranger to wearing strappy things and see-through things. Like I'm wearing a see-through top currently, and then I've got my harness and my collar on. So this fits really well into my wardrobe. With that said, I'm going to finish this video here. If you did enjoy it, please give it a like down below. Comment what else you'd like me to do and subscribe as I post a new video every single week, and I'd love to see you again. But until then, bye!